How can DoDEA maintain a safe and secure learning environment for students? National School Safety expert Dr. Marleen Wong will answer this question and more coming up next in the chat room. Welcome to the chat room. I'm your host, Frank O'Gara. Recently, the chat room went on location to the DoDEA Elementary Counseling Conference held in Peachtree City, Georgia. There, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Marleen Wong, Director of Crisis Counseling and Intervention Services for the Los Angeles Unified School District and a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Recognized by the White House as one of the nation's leading school safety experts, Dr. Wong spoke with me about her work with DoDEA educators and school safety issues ranging from school violence to natural disaster recovery. Dr. Wong, it's a pleasure to have you here in the chat room. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Frank.
The topic of safe and secure schools is one that is of major interest to our customers, to our military families, to commanders, and certainly to our principals and our educators all over the globe. And it's something, I mean, quite frankly, we think that we've been very fortunate that we have schools that are largely safe and secure. They're largely free from the violence that you find in many stateside schools, particularly in the urban areas. Okay, but we also know that that we have to remain ever vigilant, that it's not something that we can rest on our laurels. Now, I know you've been talking with our counselors all around the world and our principals as well about a process for making sure that safe and secure schools stay on the top of the agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, most definitely. It's a four-stage process that's pretty simple, but it involves an assessment that each school should make about the kinds of challenges that they might face, the kinds of risks that they face. And based on that assessment, the four-point process has to do with prevention. What kinds of preventive actions can be taken? So whether it's a natural disaster or what we call a man-made disaster, an external threat or an internal threat, what can be done to prevent a crisis or critical event from happening? The second part is, after that assessment, what steps can be taken then to prepare the school to be safe? And to give you an example of a school district that's in earthquake country, if they know that parents are at a long distance away from the school, to make sure that they have food and water for the students and for the faculty for about 72 hours until parents can come to reclaim their children. After the preventive actions, the third portion is a response, an effective crisis response to reach out to children and to families to make sure that they return to school, to provide them with crisis intervention and support. And then the fourth process is recovery. How do we help then students, faculty, families recover from a traumatic event, whether it's a traumatic loss or whether it's a natural disaster which has created a lot of destruction in the community?
Now, obviously every phase is very important, but the response phase, I think, is one that you've spent a lot of time talking to our counselors and our principals about. Can we expand on that a little bit?
Oh, happy to do so. That's really the area in which I probably know most. And that is that it's important, we've learned from research, that early intervention with children really helps them to recover much more quickly. So reaching out to children, reaching out to families, and encouraging them to return to school, to a calm routine, and to help them restore, the teachers in particular, the learning environment so that children can get right back to learning and teachers can get back to teaching and parents can relax and go back to their normal routines. That helps children most. So what I'm presenting and providing is information, the latest research, best practices about how our counselors and all of the faculty and administrators can do that after a crisis event.
Now, how important is the role of crisis teams in addressing these different phases, and in particular in addressing the response phase?
Crisis teams are very important, and counselors, school psychologists, and social workers are really at the forefront of the crisis team effort. They're really the core members of the team, in addition to the principal and, of course, the school nurse or the custodian, etc. But they provide a very vital service, and that is that they really pay attention to the symptoms that the children exhibit. Often adults assess how children are doing by what they think the children should be thinking. So in other words, I might say, well, that was a minor incident. Nobody got hurt. You know, fortunately, the mother was not killed in this accident. It should be easy for the child to kind of overcome that. But from the child's point of view, it may be, this is the second accident my mom's had. I almost lost her the first time. She was injured. I mean, we don't know what the child's history is until that crisis incident begins. And so reaching out and really understanding what are the ways in which the child is reacting, that's a determining factor about what is needed in terms of the response and the recovery process.
Now, schools obviously can't do this alone, and in our military communities, our crisis teams interact with the military community and the resources that we have. How important is that interaction and the partnership that exists between a community and the school?
Well, we think partnerships are crucial because there is expertise within DoDEA. I'm very impressed with the level of, knowledge and skill of the counselors and school psychologists and the educators, but we also, sometimes the needs of the children or the families might be at a higher level, so we need the community resources as well. When a crisis occurs, that partnership just enhances then the crisis response.
Now, when a principal is putting together a crisis team, they do this routinely. I mean, they don't do it when a crisis happens, but they have it in place for the beginning of each school year. What are the qualities that they ought to be looking for in the folks that they select among the school staff to be on these teams?
Well, the first is a sense of responsibility beyond normal routine. In other words, I might be a school psychologist with a lot of testing responsibility, and I've got a schedule, but it's when a crisis occurs for me to realize this is a time when I need to set aside my schedule, and my first priority now are these children and what they're going through. That's true for anyone. So whether it's a teacher or whether it's a counselor, a social worker, or a school nurse, a responsibility to say, this is my routine, this is my schedule, but for now, the crisis is more important. The second is the ability to establish rapport immediately. So even if I don't know this child, the way that I introduce myself, the way that I make myself available, the way that I'm able to empathize with that child is so important. And children really pick up on that, and they can sense that. So the principal looking at who should be on the crisis team, someone who can establish rapport right away. And I think the third thing is quite crucial. I mean, there are a number of other qualities as well, but I want to emphasize these first three. And that is that sometimes it's difficult for adults to listen to the feelings and suffering of children. I've had adults who care about the children deeply say, I cannot stand to hear about them being attacked. I can't tolerate them being hurt. And it's really important for the adults to be able to say, I'm going to listen to you, to everything that you tell me, because it's important for me to know. And so those three qualities are very important for crisis team members.
Now, when we talk about crises, I mean, there's an incredible range of things that happen. And for us in our military schools, I mean, one of the obvious would be natural disasters that you mentioned before, like earthquakes. And of course, we have a lot of deployment-related crises that occur today in military communities. But I want to talk first a little bit about just the normal life experiences and the kinds of things that our crisis teams will get involved with in everyday events that happen in life.
Yes, the things that can happen in everyday life are sudden, unexpected, and overwhelming. So the death of a child in an accident can be quite overwhelming. I'll give you an example in high school. Whether it's stateside or whether it's in a school anywhere around the world, a great kid gets a car, his first car, her first car, they're driving, they get into an accident. It's a very common experience in schools. And there's serious injury, or maybe sometimes there's a death, and the entire school would be thrown into grief. And that's a time when the crisis team plays a very important role to help the students understand this within the context of just personal safety, of growing up, of developmental challenges. Maybe it's the first time that they've ever experienced someone close to them dying. It's a very serious life experience. And so the crisis team members play an important role to help to support and bring students back to school and help them through that grieving process.
So on the surface, you would think sometimes that when you use the example of a death of a family member or even the death of a child, that you know, it's a tragedy for a family, but you're saying it goes far beyond that, the impact of it, the ripple effect within the school community.
Yes, I think when, especially in a community as close-knit as the DoDEA, a school family, that when a loss is felt, it's felt quite broadly, quite widely. And the sense of empathy and the compassion for that family's loss or that school's loss can be quite broad. And so it's important then for the students and the families to see that there is in place a group of people who are available and ready to, you know, to help the students to overcome and to work through that situation.
You know, this topic is so critical for our teachers because the, you know, the impact of deployment-related issues, and when we have fatalities in our military communities, it's just critical. Very often, I mean, if we have a first grader who loses a mom or a dad in some kind of combat situation, it's not just that particular family, but a teacher, a first grade teacher now has got, you know, 20 other students, okay, that they're dealing with, okay, who are wondering the same thing sometimes. Will my dad be the next person, okay? How does a teacher deal with this kind of situation?
I think that's a very difficult reality to confront, but I was very moved and encouraged by and inspired actually by the sense of mission that is shared by the DoDEA school family. And I think that keeping everyone's eyes on the fact that we're here to support those children so that their parents can fulfill the mission on behalf of all the people in the country, in the United States, is something that I've come to admire greatly. And I think that it puts into place for those students and for those families and for all the school family why they're there. And so, you know, this idea of the crisis team is just one more part of that. How do we support the mission?
Now, I know that one of your areas of expertise is post-traumatic stress, and we hear a lot of conversation about post-traumatic stress today among active duty members, among the military. But what about the impact of post-traumatic stress on children? How real of an issue is this for us and for our teachers?
You know, post-traumatic stress and everything we know about it comes from war. And there have been historical accounts of soldiers, you know, in Greece and in Sparta, of soldiers who suffered, warriors who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's something that is part of military history. But the history and development of the science about post-traumatic stress disorder for children is very recent. We look back at PTSD for soldiers, and the first really full-scale study was done after the Vietnam War, and it was commissioned by the Veterans Administration. But what is known about children just began really in 1987, when it was recognized that children could experience the full effects of PTSD if they were exposed as witnesses to violence. In other words, they didn't necessarily have to be victims, but they could watch a fellow student be beaten or killed, and the studies were done in urban areas, you know, where there was gang violence or crime or drug abuse, etc. And so now, as we move forward, we realize that children who experience the loss of a parent can experience traumatic grief, that they can be preoccupied with that event. In other words, they can experience the same things that adults go through, where the images of that can come up into their minds at times when they don't expect it. It can be a quiet time, in fact, and they can begin to think about what happened to my dad, what happened to my mom. They can be startled very easily, so if they hear loud noises, they're highly reactive, more so than other children. their ability to cope with daily activities is much diminished because their energy and the brain function is all sort of devoted to trying to figure out what happened here in this other situation. And then part of this idea that they have what's called hyperarousal, that they're always on alert for that happening again. I've lost my dad, will I lose my mom? Will I lose someone else in my family? Will my best friend? They'll go away, and those losses then become quite heightened. Now, they can have interrupted sleep, and that's kind of the thing that school nurses need to pay attention to, because if the child is having interrupted sleep, their brains aren't recalibrating every day so that they're ready to learn in the morning, and then these effects become cumulative, just like any other kind of cumulative stress. So we need to pay attention also to those physical kinds of reactions. Post-traumatic stress disorder in children is becoming more common, and in the stateside, outside of the DoDEA system, there's some sense that this generation of children has been exposed to more community violence than any other previous generation. And now we have the war on terrorism, now we have the Middle East conflict, and then of course, if the child has been exposed to any kind of domestic violence or child abuse, this trauma history then heightens their risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, and not only from a chronic situation, but there are spikes if they're exposed to even more trauma in the future.
Well, this is certainly an important issue for us, and one that will be on our radar for a long time to come, and we appreciate your expertise in this regard. Now, Dr. Wong, you've had an opportunity now to visit with our counselors in the Pacific, to talk with our principals in Europe, and also to work with our folks here in our stateside operations. So I'd like to ask you for a little assessment. How are we doing with regard to these issues?
I am so impressed with the DoDEA system. I'm so impressed with the counselors, the psychologists, the principals, the educators, the administrators. This is a model system, and I think it's a system that stateside, other school districts, I've heard people say, even before I began to work with DoDEA, that they wanted to emulate. How do they do this? How does DoDEA create students who are so successful? How do they have great graduation rates, they go on to college, they're productive citizens under the most stressful situations. So I think the sense of cohesion, the sense of mission, common mission, the sense of dedication is so extensive that it really just provides a system of support. DoDEA puts its arms around the children, of military service members, and does just a great job.
Well, thank you for those comments, and we certainly appreciate the expertise that you brought to us as a school system, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Oh, it's been an honor to work with all of you. Thank you.
You can find more about Safe Schools on our website. Thank you for joining us in this edition of The Chat Room.